The first time I smiled after my wife died, I felt guilty. We've been married for 42 years. For months after the funeral, I thought grief was something you eventually got over. Instead, it became part of every morning, every meal, every empty chair in the house. Then one afternoon, my daughter handed me something she found while cleaning. It was a notebook, one I'd never seen before. Inside was a list of places my wife had always hoped we'd visit together. One place was circled twice: the Philippines. I stared at that page for a long time because somewhere along the way I'd forgotten we were still making plans. I had no idea that honoring one of Linda's forgotten dreams would slowly teach me how to live again. And it all started with a promise I never thought I'd keep. Linda and I met when we were both 23. I always joked that she fell in love with me because I owned a pickup truck. She always said she married me because I made terrible pancakes. The truth was, we'd probably both been right. 42 years sounds like a long time, but somehow it feels shorter when you're looking back. Life has a way of blending together. The birthdays, the anniversaries, the family vacations, the ordinary Tuesday nights sitting on the couch watching television. Those are the moments I miss the most. Linda wasn't someone who needed expensive things. She found joy in the smallest moments. The first warm day after winter, fresh flowers on the kitchen table, coffee on the back porch, watching birds land in the yard while she watered her plants. Sometimes I'd look outside before work, and she'd already be talking to the flowers like they were old friends. I'd laugh and ask, "You know they can't hear you, right?" She'd smile without even looking up. "They don't have to." That was Linda. She somehow made ordinary days feel important. Every Friday night, we had the same routine. I'd pick up takeout from the little diner in town. She'd make popcorn anyway because she insisted movie nights weren't complete without it. We probably watched the same old movies 20 times. Neither of us cared. It wasn't about the movie. It was about sitting beside each other. Looking back, I don't remember many of the big days. I remember the little ones. The morning she stole bacon off my plate. The way she'd reach over and straighten my collar before church. How she'd always fall asleep 5 minutes before the end of every movie, then ask me how it ended, every single time. Even when we'd watched it before. Those little moments become invisible while you're living them. You assume there will always be another Friday night, another cup of coffee, another morning together. Then one day, there isn't. Linda got sick during the spring. At first, we both convinced ourselves it wasn't anything serious. She even joked about it. "I've got too many flowers to take care of. I'm not going anywhere." I smiled because that's exactly what I wanted to believe too. But life doesn't always ask what we're ready for. The months that followed became doctor's appointments, waiting rooms, and quiet drives home where neither of us knew what to say. I won't tell you much about those days, not because I've forgotten them, because some memories still belong only to us. One autumn morning, I kissed my wife goodbye. I didn't know it would be the last time. People tell you that time helps. Maybe it does. But time doesn't set an extra place at the dinner table. It doesn't answer when you say something out loud without thinking. And it definitely doesn't stop you from reaching across the bed in the middle of the night, only to remember you're alone. The first year after Linda was gone, I stayed busy. At least, that's what I told everyone. I mowed the lawn, fixed things that didn't really need fixing, organized the garage twice, cleaned out closets, anything that filled another hour. The truth was, I wasn't moving forward. I was just finding different ways to avoid standing still. My daughter noticed before I did. One Saturday afternoon, she stopped by with lunch. After we finished eating, she looked around the house. Everything was exactly the way her mother had left it. Linda's gardening gloves still hung beside the back door. Her favorite coffee mug was still in the cabinet. Even her reading glasses were sitting on the little table next to her chair. I hadn't moved any of it. Not because I couldn't, because I wasn't ready. My daughter didn't tell me to clean the house. She didn't tell me to move on. She simply hugged me before she left. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Dad, I don't think Mom would want the house to become a museum." I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew she was right. A week later, she came back carrying a small notebook. "I found this while I was going through Mom's desk," she said. "I thought you should have it." It wasn't a diary. It wasn't filled with long journal entries. It was much simpler than that. Just little notes. Recipes she wanted to try. Books she hoped we'd read together. Places she'd circled in travel magazines. Dreams she'd written down so she wouldn't forget them. I smiled when I saw one page. In Linda's handwriting, she'd written, "Someday, let's stop making excuses." Below it was a short list. See autumn in Vermont. Take a train through the Canadian Rockies. Spend Christmas somewhere warm. Visit the Philippines. I stared at those 4 words longer than anything else on the page. Visit the Philippines. I honestly couldn't remember the last time we'd talked about it. Life had gotten busy. The kids, work, bills, then retirement planning. Somewhere along the way, our someday had quietly disappeared. I closed the notebook, looked at my daughter, and quietly said, "I forgot we were still making plans." She reached across the table, put her hand on mine, and smiled through tears. So did Mom, but she never stopped hoping. That night, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee. The same place Linda loved every spring. The flowers she'd planted were beginning to bloom again. For the first time in months, I didn't ask myself, how do I get through tomorrow? Instead, I found myself asking something different. What if? What if it's not too late to finish one of her dreams? For the next few weeks, the notebook stayed on the kitchen table. Every morning, I'd walk past it. Sometimes I'd open it. Sometimes I'd just run my hand across the cover. One evening, my daughter called. She asked if I thought any more about the Philippines. I told her the truth. I don't know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, Dad, what are you afraid of? I started listing practical things. The long flight, the heat, traveling alone, being so far from home. She listened patiently. Then she softly said, I don't think those are the real reasons. She knew me too well. The truth was, I wasn't afraid of the Philippines. I was afraid of enjoying it. Because if I enjoyed it, what would that say about Linda? Would smiling somehow mean I left her behind? Would laughing again mean I've forgotten 42 years together? Those thoughts don't always make sense. Grief rarely does. A few days later, I went back to the cemetery. I brought fresh flowers, the kind Linda always planted every spring. I sat there for a long time, talking out loud, just like I had every Sunday since she'd been gone. I told her about the notebook, about the Philippines, about how guilty I felt for even thinking about going. Then I laughed, a real laugh, because I suddenly remembered something she'd said years earlier. We were watching one of those travel shows she loved. The host was walking through a busy street market somewhere in Southeast Asia. Linda smiled and said, If I ever go before you, I expect you to keep living enough for both of us. At the time, I'd laughed and told her she wasn't allowed to talk like that. She smiled. I'm serious. Life's too short to stop living while you're still here. I'd forgotten that conversation. Or maybe I'd buried it because it hurt too much to remember. When I got home, I opened my laptop. Not to book a flight, just to look. Flights, hotels, weather, the places Linda had circled in her notebook. I spent nearly 2 hours reading. Then I closed the computer. Not because I decided to stay, because for the first time, leaving didn't feel impossible anymore. 3 days later, my daughter stopped by again. She walked into the kitchen, looked at me, then looked at the airline confirmation sitting on the table. She smiled, didn't say a word. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, Mom would be so proud of you. I wasn't sure she would write. Not yet, but for the first time, I hoped she was. The flight felt longer than I remembered. Not because of the hours, because every mile carried me farther away from the life Linda and I had built together. When I finally stepped outside the airport, the heat hit me all at once. Warm air, the smell of grilled food somewhere nearby, motorcycles, people talking, car horns. Everything felt louder than home. I climbed into a taxi. As we drove through the city, I watched everything pass by outside the window. Small neighborhood stores, children playing basketball in flip-flops, people sitting outside talking long after the sun had gone down. I should have been fascinated. Instead, I found myself thinking, what am I doing here? That first night, I barely slept. Jet lag, an unfamiliar room, an unfamiliar country. At one point, I almost reached for my phone to see if there were any earlier flights home. The next morning, I decided to take a walk. No destination, just walk. The streets were already alive. Someone was sweeping outside their home. A woman smiled as she watered flowers growing in old paint buckets. An elderly man sitting outside a small sorry store nodded as I walked past. "Good morning," he said. I smiled politely. "Morning." He pointed toward the empty plastic chair beside him. "Coffee?" Back home, I probably would have thanked him and kept walking. Instead, for reasons I still don't completely understand, I sat down. His English wasn't perfect. My understanding of his life wasn't either. But for nearly an hour, we talked about our children, growing older, the weather, the places we'd both called home. We laughed more than I expected, mostly because neither of us completely understood the other all the time. Turns out, you don't need perfect conversations to enjoy someone's company. Before I left, he reached out and shook my hand. "You come back tomorrow," he said. "We drank coffee again." I smiled. I'd like that. As I walked back toward my hotel, I realized something. That was the first conversation I'd had with a stranger in longer than I could remember. The days that followed were filled with little moments. Nothing extraordinary. Children waving as I walked past. Neighbors inviting me to sit in the shade. Families sharing meals that somehow always had room for one more person. Nobody knew I was a widower. Nobody treated me with pity. They simply treated me like another person sitting at the table. And without realizing it, I slowly stopped introducing myself as the man who lost his wife. I was simply Tom. A few mornings later, I found myself sitting outside with another cup of coffee. The same elderly man waved as he opened his little store. Children walked past on their way to school. Someone nearby was watering flowers planted in old pots along the sidewalk. Without thinking, I smiled. Then, almost immediately, I caught myself. The old guilt returned. The same feeling I'd been carrying ever since Linda was gone. The quiet voice inside me asking, should you really be happy? As I sat there, watching the morning slowly come to life, a memory found me. Not because I was looking for it, because sometimes the right memories arrive exactly when you need them. It was years earlier, one Saturday morning. Linda was outside watering her flowers. I walked out with 2 cups of coffee. She smiled and took one from my hand. Then she pointed toward a tiny yellow flower growing between 2 cracks in the driveway. I laughed. "You know that's just a weed." She looked at me, shook her head, and smiled. "No, It's a flower, growing where nobody expected it to. At the time, I thought she was talking about the garden. Sitting there in the Philippines, I suddenly realized she'd been talking about life. Linda had always believed beauty had a way of finding us, even after heartbreak, even after loss, even in places we'd never planned to be. I looked around. Children were laughing. Someone across the street was hanging laundry in the morning sunshine. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the houses. The woman watering her flowers smiled and waved. I waved back. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for smiling, because I finally understood something. Smiling wasn't leaving Linda behind. It was carrying forward everything she'd spent 42 years teaching me. Later that afternoon, I opened the notebook again. This time, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. On the very last page, written in Linda's familiar handwriting, was one short sentence. Promise me we'll never stop being curious about the world. I laughed softly to myself. You win. I looked up toward the sky, still smiling. I guess we're finally here. That evening, I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. Dad? I didn't tell her about the flowers, or the coffee, or the notebook. Instead, I simply said, I think your mom would have liked it here. There was a long silence. Then she quietly replied, I think she would have liked seeing you smile again. I looked down at the notebook resting on my lap. For the first time since Linda had been gone, those words didn't make me cry. They made me grateful. When I returned home, everything looked exactly the same. The house, the porch, the flowers Linda had planted years earlier. Even her old coffee mug was still sitting in the cabinet. But something inside me had changed. For the first time in a very long while, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Over the next several months, I found myself doing things I hadn't done since Linda passed away. I invited my grandchildren over more often. I started taking morning walks again. I even planted a few new flowers beside the ones Linda had cared for all those years. Not because I was replacing what she'd planted, because I knew she'd want them to keep growing. One evening, I sat on the back porch with the notebook in my lap. The same notebook that had spent months sitting untouched on the kitchen table. I slowly turned to the page with her list. One by one, I looked at each place she'd written down. Then I smiled, picked up a pen, and drew a small check mark beside one of them. Visit the Philippines. I looked up toward the evening sky, then quietly said, we finally made it. A few months later, I sold the house. Not because I wanted to erase 42 years of memories, because I realized those memories didn't live inside the walls. They lived inside me. Wherever I went, Linda would go too. I retired to the Philippines, not because I was running away from my old life, but because I was finally ready to keep living the life we dreamed about together. People sometimes ask me if moving here helped me forget my wife. I always smile. Then I tell them the truth. No, it helped me remember her better. Because everywhere I look now, I notice the little things she always noticed. The flowers growing where nobody expected them. The conversations with strangers. The mornings that begin with coffee instead of rushing somewhere. The laughter of children playing outside. The simple joy of slowing down long enough to appreciate another ordinary day. For years, I thought grief meant holding on to yesterday. Linda spent 42 years trying to teach me something different. She taught me that love doesn't disappear when someone is gone. It changes. It becomes part of the way you see the world. The first time I smiled after my wife died, I felt guilty. Today, when I smile, I feel grateful. Not because I've forgotten her, because I carry her with me every single day. Looking back now, I don't think the Philippines gave me a new life. It simply reminded me of the life Linda always hoped I'd keep living. And if she was sitting beside me right now, holding her morning coffee, looking out at another beautiful sunrise, I think she'd probably smile, look over at me, and say exactly what she always did whenever life surprised us. See? I told you we'd get here someday. I guess you were right, Linda. We finally did.